Howdy AP Comparative Kids. As you can see, I'm out again with Sick Child. Today we're going to talk about just a recap of the electoral systems that we talked about in class, and a little bit on what are called linkage institutions, because they link the government institutions to the people. So here we go. First of all, as far as electoral systems, you already know a lot of the basics. Let's go through them. The electoral systems basically decide how votes are cast, counted, and translated into seats. So when we did the simulation in class, you guys cast votes in many different ways, and you can see how they can be counted in different ways, and they can be translated into government seats in different ways. So if I take the first-past-the-post system, whoever gets the most votes wins. But if we looked at something like alternative vote, you may end up with a different candidate in office, essentially. So, already mentioned it, first past the post. It's also known as plurality at times. First past the post is the system the United States uses, the UK uses, Nigeria uses it, and it's pretty straightforward. Whoever gets the most votes wins, regardless if they get a majority or less. It does not necessarily matter. Now, some systems tweak this a little bit, requiring that the candidate has to receive a majority, and then they would have a runoff if someone doesn't reach the majority, like Russia does that. But most first-past-the-post systems just have winner takes all. So, for example, let's say the upcoming senator election in Wisconsin, you have Tammy Baldwin and a whole host of other candidates. Let's say Tammy Baldwin has 32% of the vote. She may still win the state of Wisconsin if the other candidates have less than her. So essentially there is, you have a candidate that could win with a minority of the population supporting them. Of course, there's a good video on this first-past-the-post system that you can watch that I assigned you yesterday. All the first-past-the-post systems use some sort of single-member districts where you're having people compete for one seat. It'd be a little different if you were competing for 2 seats and like the top 2 contenders made it through. Single-member districts, like in the UK, where they have 600 some different seats, they are single districts where you're competing for 1 seat. Now, of course, these end up creating very broad-based parties, like in the United States, where we have Republicans and Democrats that are very moderate in a way. They're much more towards the center, trying to cover as many people as possible, and trying to establish essentially that 2-party system. Now, of course, you can watch that video about the problems with the first-past-the-post system. It points out some of the issues and how we end up with very large, broad-based parties, but certainly you could read about this as well. Now, the other system that would be available would be called proportional representation. This is where you essentially vote for a political party, and the political party has a list of candidates, and they choose the, if a party wins like 20% of the vote, they get 20% of the seats in the legislature. This can result in your more party variety. There's a lot more parties involved. It creates a district with multiple members in it. So if we had a country and we said we were using proportional representation for the whole legislature, that would mean the entire country is essentially in one district with multiple members coming out of it, multiple people going to the legislative branch, which can also be kind of strange because you could be voting for a party and not have anyone local in that political party. So you could essentially vote for a candidate and they might not even be in your region or city or state. So once again, this encourages multiple parties. Some examples of ballots in the past. You vote for a political party, and if they get a certain percentage, they're going to get a certain percentage of seats from their lists below them. Now, of course, some states do choose to use what are called thresholds. Thresholds would be, you have to have a certain percentage to get any seats in the legislature. So a lot of states that use PR would have like a 5% threshold. Israel has a 2% threshold. Russia's had a 7% threshold. It's trying to keep out really tiny parties. So you're not just getting a party for having 1% of the population support you. You got to have a little more support to be a party in the legislature. So it still encourages multiple parties, but not too many small parties. Now, another system that could be available is a mixed system. You could have people voting for local candidates in a single member district and also voting for a political party. For example, in Russia, not in Russia, but in Mexico, I'll use Mexico as an example, their legislature is divided up where when you go vote, you vote for your local seat and you also vote for the PR half of the legislature. So half the legislature is PR and half the legislature is first past the post, which can benefit the country because it has a lot of the elements of both. It has the idea that you have a local representative that's representing you with that single member district. It also benefits you that you have more parties in the government. Now, certainly there are other elections too. When you go to the ballot box, you're not always voting for people. Sometimes you're voting for initiatives like referendums. Referendums are a vote on a policy. More often than not, they are what would be called a plebiscite, which would be a vote that is non-binding. Like the UK likes to call things referendums, but they're actually just non-binding votes. For example, they just had the Brexit vote, in which the United Kingdom voted very narrowly to leave the European Union. But this wasn't binding, so the Parliament had to basically approve leaving of the European Union. And now they're in the 2-year process of actually leaving the institution. Now, another type of referendum or a vote of the people is called an initiative. And an initiative is a little unique. It is typically made by petition. So the people are actually asking for this type of essentially referendum. For example, in California, they use a lot of initiatives. They call them props, typically, or proposals. So anyone in California can get anything on the ballot if they get enough signatures for it. So this could be stuff like decreasing taxes. It could be stuff like opening parks. It could be stuff like helping out education. Anything could become an initiative and become law by vote of the people. Now, certainly elections link the people to their government, but there are other institutions that go towards linking the people to their government. They're typically called linkage institutions. Elections are one of them, but certainly there are other entities. The other entities are political parties, interest groups, and media. You can see how media would link the people to their government. First of all, it allows you to see what the government's doing. It allows people to be interviewed in the government to hear what you think. So it creates a connection between the people and the system. Now, of course, political parties play a major role as well. Political parties are a group of people that get together to try and get people elected, to get them into office. So it's a great way to influence government in your country because you have a chance to actually choose the people in your government and influence them on what they believe. So if you were to join up with a political party, you might be able to influence the candidates to push forward some policies that you agree with. And this is a little different from an interest group. An interest group is also a group of like-minded individuals, but they don't try to get people elected. Interest groups focus in on trying to get their issues heard, on trying to get policies passed by government, but they don't necessarily get candidates elected. That would make them a political party. So an interest group does a lot of research, they do a lot of campaigning, they do a lot of lobbying the government officials to try and get some sort of influence here. And it's important to go a little further with interest groups because this is something that we can really compare between countries later on. For example, in some countries, interest groups are very restricted, as in you're not allowed to have a lot of interest groups. In some countries, the interest groups are part of the government. In Mexico, for a good portion of their history, the government actually created interest groups to be able to get ideas from the people, to get ideas of what they wanted. And of course, you could have countries where interest groups are just allowed to freely exist, where people are participating in politics, participating in government as they see fit in these interest groups. There is something to think about. That is all for this video on elections and linkage institutions. I will see you later in potentially another video.